The Geological History of Iowa, prepared by the Iowa Geological and Water Survey with assistance from the Iowa Limestone Producers Association. Part 1. Principles of Geologic Science. To gain even a basic understanding of geology requires the understanding of a few rules that geologists play by. These are called key principles and include a series of assumptions, theories, and procedures that help geologists unravel the mystery of Earth's history. These include uniformitarianism, superposition, inclusions and components, faunal succession, plate tectonics, and age dating in geologic time. We will review and explain these principles individually. Uniformitarianism is the assumption that the same natural laws and processes that operate in the universe today have always operated in the past and apply everywhere. This principle is often summarized by the phrase, "The present is the key to the past." So when we observe volcanoes erupting, limestones being deposited in oceans, and rivers carrying sediments and eroding rocks, we can assume that these same processes functioned in the geologic past. The idea of uniformitarianism originated with the work of Scottish geologist James Hutton. In 1785, Hutton presented to the Royal Society of Edinburgh his idea that the Earth had a long history and that this history could be interpreted in terms of the processes currently observed. He also suggested that supernatural theories were not needed to explain geologic history of the Earth. Hutton's ideas did not gain major support in the scientific community until the work of Sir Charles Lyell. In his book, The Principles of Geology, published in 1833, Lyell presented a variety of geologic evidence from England, France, Italy, and Spain to prove Hutton's ideas correct. Can you think of some other examples of uniformitarianism that would be important to geologists? The principle of superposition states that sedimentary layers are deposited in a time sequence, with the oldest on the bottom and the youngest on the top. The law was formulated in the 17th century by Danish scientist Nicholas Steno. Although the principle of superposition was formulated for sedimentary rocks, it also applies to volcanic rocks like those shown in this photo. The law of superposition would tell future geologists that the lava flow was newer than the road it flowed over. Some rock sequences can be found where older rocks are on top. Can you think of some processes that can generate this situation? An excellent place to see the law of superposition in action is at the Grand Canyon, where a thick sequence of sedimentary rock layers is exposed. At the base of the section, the 1.75 billion year old Vishnu schist is exposed at the level of the Colorado River. Above the Vishnu, the Cambrian Tapete sandstone was deposited about 525 million years ago. Then, the 515 million year old Bright Angel Shale was deposited. The Mauve limestone was laid down 10 million years later. Then, during the Mississippian, about 350 million years ago, the Red Wall limestone was deposited. Above the Red Wall is a Supai group deposited between about 320 and 290 million years ago. The Permian Hermit Shale was the next unit deposited, about 280 million years ago. Then the Coconino sandstone, and finally the top of the Grand Canyon section, the 270 million year old Kaibab limestone. The long periods of time between some of these geologic units are known as unconformities. They are periods of time when there was no deposition, or periods where materials were deposited then eroded away. Another key principle of geologic science is the principle of inclusions and components. This principle states that if a sedimentary rock contains an inclusion of another material, then this inclusion must be older than the rock that holds it. Here we see a rock called a conglomerate that is composed of rounded pieces of many types of rock that were naturally cemented together. The principle of inclusions and components tells us that all of the rounded rocks that comprise the conglomerate must be older than the conglomerate itself. This principle was originally stated by Charles Lyell in his multi-volume Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833. Similar inclusions are created when a subsurface magma intrudes a pre-existing rock, called a country rock, and incorporates pieces of the country rock into the melt. When the magma solidifies, the fragments of the country rock, called xenoliths, must be older than the solidified magma rock which contains them. Here we see a dark gray xenolith that was incorporated into an inclusion of magma that cooled to form the light gray rock. Faunal succession is another key principle of geology. The principle of faunal succession is based on the observation that sedimentary rock strata contain fossilized flora and fauna, that is, plants and animals, and that these fossils succeed one another vertically in a specific reliable order that can be identified over a wide horizontal distance. So in this illustration, the geologic section in the quarry on the left contains two specific fossils in bed 2 and 3, and three different specific fossils in bed 5. Fossils identical to those in bed 2 and 3 are found in bed C and D on the geologic exposure section on the right. Therefore, the principle of faunal succession can be used to say that rocks exposed in beds C and D are the same as the beds 2 and 3 in the quarry. Similarly, the other fossils found in bed 5 in the quarry show that it is the same age as bed F in the exposure section, which contains the same fossils. With these key beds identified, geologists are able to correlate the other beds in the section of the quarry to those in the section of the exposure. One of the key developments that has helped geologists understand many of the details of Earth's geologic history is the theory of plate tectonics. Plate tectonics describes a process by which the Earth's crustal plates move and interact with one another. It is a process that produces most of the world's mountains, volcanoes, and earthquakes, such as the magnitude 9 Tohoku earthquake that occurred off the coast of Japan on March 11, 2011, one of the largest in Earth's history. The earthquake and the tsunami it generated killed almost 16,000 Japanese and did an estimated $235 billion worth of damage to the country and its economy. The outer layer of the Earth, its crust, is composed of two principal components, oceanic crust and continental crust. The oceanic crust is composed of dense, black, iron and magnesium-rich volcanic rocks, dominantly basalt. These are the rocks that you see on Hawaii and the other volcanic islands. The continental crust is composed of lighter, silica and aluminum-rich igneous rocks, dominantly granite, such as these exposed at Stone Mountain, Georgia. This crust is broken into a series of large and small crustal plates. Most of these plates include both oceanic and continental crustal material. The oceanic crust is much thinner, averaging only about 6 miles in thickness and reaching a maximum of about 12 miles. The thicker continental crust averages about 27 miles and reaches a maximum of about 45 miles. As mentioned earlier, the oceanic crust is denser, about 3 grams per cubic centimeter, as opposed to the continental crust average of about 2.7 grams per cubic centimeter. As the oceanic crust gets older, it continues to thicken as mantle material is added to its base. Eventually, the oceanic crust gets so dense it breaks free from the continental crust and sinks into the mantle, a process called subduction. The zone of subduction marks the edge of a continental plate. Ocean crust that is lost to subduction is replaced by new crust that forms when magma from the mantle moves upward into the spreading centers. If we color each of the major plates differently, it's a little easier to tell them apart. Each of the Earth's continents has its own plate, with parts of some continents on more than one plate. Each of the Earth's tectonic plates is moving in a direction shown by the arrows on this map. The length of each arrow indicates the relative speed that the plates are moving. The long arrows faster, the shorter ones slower. The average speed of movement of these plates is about 1 centimeter per year. That's about the speed that your fingernails grow. But how is it that plates with no space between them can be moving in different directions and at different speeds? In order to allow this variability of plate movement direction and speed, they interact with one another in 3 principal ways. The first is when two plates are moving away from one another. This is called divergence, and it usually happens beneath an ocean. Areas where divergence is occurring are called spreading centers because the plates are growing and spreading away from one another along these zones. Material moves up from the mantle to become the new oceanic crust. The blue lines here show the areas of divergent plate boundaries. An example of a divergent plate boundary is a mid-Atlantic ridge. Another way that plates interact with one another is where they are crashing together, called convergence. The red lines show the plates that are converging. Plates can converge along zones where the oceanic crust of one plate is subducting beneath the oceanic crust of another plate, called ocean-ocean subduction. The oceanic crust of one plate can subduct beneath the continental crust of another plate. This is called ocean-continent subduction. Or the continental crust of one plate can crash into the continental crust of another plate, a process called continent-continent collision. In this case, only the dense lower portion of the crust, or the lithosphere, is subducted into the mantle. The lighter continental crust is too light to be subducted, so it just piles up at the zone of collision. An example of a continent-continent collision is the zone where the Indian plate is colliding with the Eurasian plate, and the continental pile-up is called the Tibetan Plateau in the Himalayan mountains. The third type of plate interaction is called strike-slip. This is when one plate is sliding sideways past another plate. Zones of strike-slip plate interaction are shown by the light green lines. An example of this kind of interaction between the North American plate and the Pacific plate is in California, where the zone that they are sliding past one another is called the San Andreas Fault Zone. On this compilation of 2012 earthquakes by the U.S. Geological Survey, you can see that most of the Earth's earthquakes occur along these plate boundaries. Most of the largest ones, that is those shown by the large circles, usually occur along subduction zones. And most volcanoes also occur along plate boundaries, especially the convergent boundaries. The so-called ring of fire around the Pacific plate is a good example of this. Most of the Pacific is surrounded by convergent plates. 452, or about 75% of the world's volcanoes, occur along the ring of fire, and about 90% of the world's earthquakes occur there. The last key principle of geologic science that we will discuss is age dating and geologic time. Geologists routinely work with millions or billions of years, so normal calendars and methods of representing spans of time don't always work very well. Fortunately, being as clever as they are, geologists have managed to come up with other ways. There are two principal types of age determination, relative and absolute. Relative age determination is the identification of an order in which a sequence of events occurred, often utilizing some of the principles that we've already learned, such as superposition, inclusions and components, and faunal succession. Absolute age determination is an attempt to put a numerical age on a rock or event. A variety of techniques are utilized by geologists to determine absolute ages. Relative age dating is the science of determining the relative order of past events without necessarily determining their absolute age. In geology, rock types and fossils can be used to correlate one sequence of rocks with another, or to determine the order of geologic events. Even though these techniques do not specifically tell geologists how old rocks are, they remain useful in understanding geologic history, especially in rocks lacking radioactive isotopes needed for absolute age determinations. In some cases, dating using fossils or biostratigraphy can actually produce a more accurate age than absolute age techniques. In the example shown in this illustration, the law of superposition tells us that the limestone layer was deposited first and is the oldest, followed by the overlying shale layer, the basalt lava layer, another shale layer, the sandstone layer, and finally the upper shale. The basalt dike must be the youngest since it cuts all the other units. Here is an opportunity to see if you can determine the order of a more complex sequence of deposition, intrusion, and faulting. Once you think that you've figured out the relative ages of these rocks and events, go on to the next slide and check your interpretations. The legend to the right of the block model shows the sequence of events, the oldest at the bottom. The sandstone was deposited first, then the siltstone, the shale, and the limestone. The volcanic ash was deposited on top of all of these. Next, the granite was intruded into the sequence, as can be seen because it cuts all of the first 5 units. The dike was intruded next because it cuts all of the units including the granite, but not the conglomerate at the top. The conglomerate was laid down on top of all these other units, and then the sequence was cut by the fault. The block on the right side moved downward with respect to the left side of the fault. Finally, extra credit if you noted that the gully was eroded along the fault zone, so it occurred after the fault movement. Fossils are very important tools in determining the relative age, using a procedure known as biostratigraphy. Paleontologists have carefully studied fossils in rocks, and using the law of superposition have been able to observe evolutionary changes in their body structure through time. Because life forms are constantly evolving new types and becoming extinct, paleontologists have selected a few key fossils that were easily preserved in rocks, abundant, and evolved quickly on a worldwide basis for each geological period. These are known as index fossils. By studying these index fossils and how they evolve through time, they can relate specific evolutionary stages to specific time units within each geologic period. So when they encounter a rock unit of unknown age, they can identify the fossils and their stage of evolution and use that to determine the geologic period and time units. The conodon is one of the best of these index fossils and is used for identifying the relative ages of marine sedimentary units. The animal lived between the late Cambrian, about 500 million years ago, through the Cretaceous, 65 million years ago, and is used extensively for dating rocks of that period. Conodonts were chordates in the class Conodontia. For many years they were known only from the tooth-like microfossils now called conodont elements that are found in isolation. Only 11 fossil imprints of the complete animal are known, and they depict an eel-like creature with 15 or more rarely 19 hard preservable elements that form a bilaterally symmetrical array in the head. This array, which constituting a fetid apparatus, is radically different from the jaws of modern animals. Although some things about this animal are not well understood, its appetite elements are durable and easily preserved. They evolved rapidly, and their evolution was simultaneous all over the world. This makes them excellent index fossils, and their many species have been studied and described in detail. They are one of the most commonly used index fossils for the period of time that they existed on Earth, and they have been critical to our understanding of the geologic history of Iowa. Absolute age dating includes a variety of techniques that are used to determine the numerical age for a geologic unit. The most commonly used technique in absolute age determination is radiometric dating, but other techniques are used, including optically stimulated luminescence dating, known as OSL, dendrochronology, and amino acid dating. The radiometric age dating technique utilizes scientists' abilities to accurately determine the ratio of atoms or isotopes of atoms in a mineral sample. Using these measured ratios and an accurate knowledge of the time required for radioactive atoms to decay into their daughter products, the time that has passed since a given mineral solidified from a melt can be calculated. A number of radioactive elements and their daughter products can be used for these calculations, but one of the most commonly used is uranium decaying into lead as captured in a zircon crystal. Zircon is a zirconium silicate, that's ZrSiO4. But since uranium and zircon atoms are about the same physical size, uranium atoms sometimes replace zirconium atoms in the mineral's crystal structure. When this happens, the uranium atom is sealed inside the zircon crystal. One of the isotopes of uranium, U-238, decays to lead-206, with half of the uranium atoms converting to lead every 4.47 billion years. This isotopic system is said to have a half-life of 4.47 billion years. So, by measuring the ratio of uranium atoms to lead atoms in the crystal, the age that that system was sealed, that is, the age that the crystallization of the zircon occurred, or the age of solidification of the magma, can be determined. These systems are complex. The chart on the left shows some of the details of the decay of uranium-238 to its various daughter products and the time involved. Some other commonly used radioactive elements are shown on the chart in the upper right. Carbon dating is frequently used to date organic material, but with a short half-life, only 5,730 years, it can only be used to date materials that are less than 60,000 years old. This limit is imposed by a scientist's ability to measure small quantities of carbon-14. As can be seen in the graph in the lower right, the percentage of parent material after only 6 half-lives is barely above zero. There are many radioactive mother-daughter products and isotope combinations that can be used for radioactive age determination, but in all cases, it is critical that both mother and daughter be tightly sealed inside a host mineral. Any fractures or other flaws in these minerals can allow the products to escape. Then the ratios are no longer accurate determinations of the mineral's age. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, or OSL, is a relatively new technique for determining how long a period of time has passed since rocks were deposited. OSL measures the energy of photons being released from certain crystals. In natural settings, ionizing radiation from cosmic rays and the decay of unstable isotopes of uranium, thorium, rubidium, and potassium is absorbed and stored by sediments in the crystal lattices of such minerals as quartz and potassium feldspar, common minerals in sand. In a laboratory, this ionization energy can be released as light or luminescence. Exposure to sunlight bleaches this luminescence signature from a mineral, effectively resetting the time clock. So, from a sample, scientists can determine the approximate number of years that have passed since the sediment was last exposed to light, that is, when it was buried by other sediments. So scientists collecting a sample for OSL dating have to take care not to expose the sample to sunlight or intense heat. This technique is typically used to determine ages from about 300 to 100,000 years old. Another age dating technique is dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. This method of dating is based on the analysis of patterns of tree rings, also known as growth rings. Since one ring grows every year, dendrochronology can be used to determine how old a tree was when it was cut, in many cases to the exact calendar year. The width of the rings vary depending on the favorability of the growing conditions in a given year, so by determining the pattern of ring width, scientists can correlate from one tree to another. In some areas of the world, it is possible to date wood back a few thousand years or even many thousand. Currently, the maximum for a complete sequence of rings from the present is a little over 11,000 years. Amino acid dating is a technique used to estimate the age of a specimen that was once a living organism. This technique is based on changes in amino acid molecules after the death of the organism. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein strings in life forms. As shown on the lower left, they are organic molecules that are based on a carbon atom, C, bonded on one side by an amine, NH2, and a carboxyl acid group, COOH, and an organic group of varying composition referred to as a side chain and usually signified by R. The other side of the atom, C, is bonded to a hydrogen atom, H. All biological tissues contain amino acids. Almost all amino acids are octavely active, with life energy keeping the amino acid in the L-aniline configuration. That is, if the side chain R is on top of the carbon atom and the carboxyl atom group COOH is above the carbon atom C, then the hydrogen atom is on the right. This is sometimes referred to as the left-hand configuration. When the organism dies, the life energy is no longer available. The amino acids begin to shift to a mirror image of the L configuration, with the hydrogen, or H, on the left side. This is called the D-aniline configuration. This shifting process is called racemization. So the ratio of D configuration to L configuration, which is 0 or all L's when the organism is alive, drifts toward 1 or equal numbers of D and L, which is the state of stability after the organism dies. The rate at which this configuration shifts is dependent on several variables, most importantly the average temperature of the area where the sample was collected. The chart on the lower right shows that warmer climates have faster racemization processes. So by measuring the ratio of D to L in a sample and having an estimate for the average temperature, scientists can estimate how long ago the specimen died, usually between about 2,000 and 2 million years. Using the various age dating techniques, geologists have constructed an organized sequence of rocks based on their ages. This sequence of named ages is called stratigraphy, and here it is depicted as a geologic clock divided proportionally to a 24-hour day. Life began very early in Earth's history, and here we can see how it evolved through time using this clock. The Earth is about 4.55 billion years old, but geologists usually talk about age in millions of years, so that is 4,550 million years old. The first indications of life on Earth are found in some of its oldest surviving marine rocks, deposited about 4,400 million years ago. These were prokaryotes, the simplest of cells. The first bacteria, a group or colony of prokaryotes, was found in sedimentary rocks deposited about 3,500 million years ago. The first synthesizing organisms appeared about 3 billion years ago. These were algae that formed mats that developed into structures called stromatolites. This picture shows modern-day stromatolites, unchanged from the forms that evolved 3 billion years ago. The first eukaryotes, or cells with a nucleus, like cells in our body, appeared on Earth about 2,700 million years ago. Multicelled organisms first appeared in the geologic record about 2,100 million years ago. These are from Michigan. The oldest animal fossils, an early form of sponge called Otavia antica, were found in Namibia's Etosha National Park and other sites around that country in rocks about 750 million years old. The first evidence of plants on land come from spores of mid-Ordovician age, about 740 million years old. Called cryptospores, their microstructure resembles that of a modern liverwort spores. The plant that they came from probably looked much like Cooksonia. The first mammals were small, furry, shrew-like creatures called Eosostradana that skittered across the high branches of trees about 230 million years ago. Depending on how human is defined, the earliest genus of Homo habilis, was found in the rocks in Africa that were deposited about 2.3 million years ago. In Iowa, we know of rocks representing these time periods. As we discuss the geologic history of Iowa, we'll discuss most of these rocks and the stories that they tell us about the geologic history of Iowa. The largest subdivisions of geologic time lump all of the rocks and events between the origin of the Earth about 4,600 million years ago and until about 540 million years ago into a group called the Precambrian Supereon. All of the rocks and events between 450 million years ago and today are lumped into the Phanerozoic Eon. The Precambrian Supereon is divided into 3 eons, the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. The Phanerozoic Eon is divided into 3 eras, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. In discussing the geological history of Iowa, we will address each of these 6 subdivisions in individual PowerPoint lectures. This completes our discussion of the principles of geologic science. Please proceed to Geologic History of Iowa, Part 2, the Hadean Eon. Also, following this slide is an appendix containing a chart listing the Earth's stratigraphic ages and their time ranges, a chronologic list of important events in Earth's history, the etymology of many period names, an illustration showing the geologic rock cycle, and a number of illustrations relating specifically to the geologic history of Iowa, including the stratigraphic column of Iowa, the Quaternary geologic map of Iowa, the bedrock geologic map of Iowa, and Iowa's Precambrian surface map.